Hello, my name's David Runciman, and this is Past, Present, Future, the History of Ideas podcast. Today, it is the return of our occasional series Now and Then with the historian Robert Saunders, in which we look at historic anniversaries and their significance for today. This episode is about something that happened 140 years ago and blew British politics wide open. How did an interview given by the son of the former Prime Minister William Gladstone turn Irish Home Rule into a question that destroyed political parties, exploded Westminster politics, and brought Britain to the brink of civil war? And what are the parallels with Brexit? Robert, we're going to be talking about how the question of Irish Home Rule effectively blew up British politics. It exploded like a bomb, and it shattered all sorts of things, not least party alliances and allegiances. And in this episode, we're particularly focusing on something that happened at the turn of the year 1885-86, so 140 years ago, as we turn from 2025 to 26. The spark that lit the fuse took place 140 years ago. Before we get on to that event, to what extent was this a ticking time bomb? So say we go back to the mid-1880s, before the event that we're going to be talking about, earlier in 1885. And if you'd said to leading politicians in Westminster, do you think Irish Home Rule is about to blow up British politics? Did they have a sense that it was something that sooner or later was going to explode?
Well, Home Rule itself only really emerges as a slogan and a platform in the 1870s, so I don't think people would necessarily see this as the issue steaming towards them on the kind of train of historical inevitability. But what it is the latest answer to a question that has been plaguing British politics for the last 80 years, and which I think is coming to a boil, which is, why has the union with Ireland failed? And the perception that the union has failed is actually one that is quite widely shared between unionists and Home Rulers. So the union itself is created in 1801, and it's a shotgun marriage, joined in the Napoleonic Wars, principally for reasons of national security. But there are all sorts of hopes invested in it. So the hope is that if you bring Ireland into the United Kingdom, then it will share in the prosperity, the peace, the stability of the United Kingdom. It will ease the sectarian divide because it will merge it in this much larger entity. And Ireland can, in a sense, follow the path that Scotland and Wales have followed in integration into this larger entity. And it's very hard to believe by the 1880s that is still working. That you look at Britain, and it is possible at least to claim that Britain is the most prosperous, the most powerful, the most stable, and the most free nation on earth. And you look at Ireland, and it is impoverished, it is agrarian, it is deeply violent, and it is obviously unstable and discontented. And that's bad for Ireland, but it's also actually becoming increasingly destabilising for Britain. Irish politics blows up the Conservative Party in 1829 and in 1846. Two members of the British government are assassinated in Dublin in the early 1880s. The Liberal Party increasingly has a sense that the Liberal project is failing in Ireland. It's passed all of these reforms, but they're not working. And increasingly, Liberal governments are having to pass coercion acts that are stripping away the most basic liberties of the British Constitution from the people of Ireland. And they're not sure they can keep doing this without endangering the freedom of Britain itself. So there is a powerful sense that Britain and Ireland are coming to a crossroads and that some new kind of path needs to be taken. The question is, why is the union failing? And what do you do about it? Is it because you haven't coerced strongly enough? Is it because Ireland has been misgoverned? Is it because there is something fundamentally wrong with the Irish people that means they can't actually be trusted with free and representative institutions? Or is there some way in which you might be able to refound the union and put it on a new basis? So Ireland is coming to the boil. It's not inevitable that Home Rule is the answer to it, but that's the answer that emerges.
And in a way, there are two tinderboxes here. in a sense that one of them is Ireland itself. And there was genuinely, as you said, if coercion fails, what comes next? The possibility that Ireland would become ungovernable. And ungovernable here means descend into violence. And then the other tinderbox is the House of Commons. It is Westminster, where Irish representation, which is a central feature of the union of Great Britain and Ireland, Irish representation in Westminster is and has been for a while one of the great uncertainties, destabilizing forces in British politics. Are these two things connected? Are they separate in the minds of the political establishment? We're going to talk about characters in a moment, but let's just call them the political establishment. Is there a direct link between the possibility of large-scale violence in Ireland itself and Irish representation in Westminster?
Yes, there is. So the question of how you retain British power over places that are strategically important to Britain, but in which there is strong hostility to British rule, is obviously not a new one. That is one that the British have been grappling with in India and in Egypt, and indeed in places like Canada, which has risings in the 1830s and 1840s. What makes Ireland particularly difficult is that it's not 1,000 miles away. It is actually right within Britain's geographical space. And after 1801, it is inside the British Constitution. And as you say, that means that it is in theory at least governed by the same laws as the rest of the UK. And it sends more than 100 members of Parliament to the House of Commons. So it has very serious and substantial representation. From the 1870s, the Irish representation outside Ulster is increasingly being hoovered up by a highly disciplined Irish party, which can use its power in Westminster actually to make the House of Commons unworkable, to bring British government and legislation to a standstill. And so government is starting to have to do very painful things about shutting down debate in Parliament and limiting the power of MPs to speak and to debate legislation. So it's starting to look like you might actually have to abolish the things that make Britain most precious in order to retain your hold on Ireland. That you're not just having to coerce Ireland, you're having to coerce the House of Commons. And that therefore, in holding on to Ireland, you will actually destroy the British Constitution itself.
Now I want to ask you about the figure who's at the heart of this story, William Gladstone, and where he stood before the event that we're going to talk about, the so-called kite. We're going to come on to what this kite is. Gladstone, let's again assume we're talking earlier in 1885, the dominant figure in British politics still. How strong was his hold on his party? He had been Prime Minister. He was not Prime Minister in 1885, but he had been Prime Minister for more than 10 years. First in 1868. So he is the grand old man of British politics. He was 75 at this point. He still had plenty more years of high politics in him, but no one knew that at the time. Was he in 1885 seen as still the man around whom British politics turned? Or was there a view that he was possibly on the way out?
There's certainly a sense that British politics orbits around Gladstone, but he's more like a meteor than a fixed star, so orbiting around him is quite difficult. Gladstone occupies a really unusual position in 1885. On the one hand, he is the most intensely moralistic politician, probably that British politics has ever seen. He's always someone who thinks of politics in terms of great moral collisions and crusades. Earlier in his life, he had wanted to be a priest. And he's always quite tormented by the sense that he might have given up his vocation because of his ambition. So it's really important to Gladstone that politics itself can be a priesthood. He has to see politics as an arena in which the salvation of souls is at stake. And he'd actually retired from the leadership in 1875, and the Liberals had elected a new leadership. But he comes out of retirement again to protest against what he sees as Disraeli's immoral and evil imperial ventures. So he returns to the leadership, but in his own mind at least, and certainly in his rhetoric, he is a temporary leader. He is somebody who has come back to deal with great moral questions, and once he's resolved those questions, will return to his library and to his books. So after 1875, he's much less concerned than he had been in the past about things like party management, or about the succession, or about the future of his party. He sees himself as someone who is there for one last task. And for all sorts of reasons we can discuss, Ireland fits very neatly into that model.
But was it clear, and this is going to be a key issue when we come to the kite, Was it clear in the election that took place late in 1885 that Ireland was the central moral cause now of Gladstone's politics? So a general election took place in which Gladstone was the Liberal leader. His party did not win that election in the sense that they won more seats, but they didn't win enough to return to government without at least addressing the question of Irish representation and who would do a deal with the Irish Party in the House of Commons. But in the election itself, did people see in Gladstone a man who was on a mission in relation to Ireland?
Gladstone himself is always on a mission. He's very much the kind of blues brother of British politics who's on a mission from God. But one of the frustrations for his critics is that that election had not been fought on Ireland, that actually it's fought very much on a Chamberlainite programme, which is about appealing particularly to agricultural labourers to whom Gladstone has just given the vote in the Third Reform Act. It's about appealing to them on a platform of 3 acres and a cow. So there'll be land reform, agricultural reform. It's a programme that's about appealing to the material interests of the new democracy. But Gladstone himself has always been consumed by Ireland. Gladstone is famous for his rather peculiar love letters that he would write to his wife, which he would always sign, "Yours sincerely, W.E. Gladstone." And there's one from the 1840s in which he writes, "Ireland, Ireland, that cloud in the west, that coming storm, that minister of God's retribution." And that sense that God's retribution hangs over Britain for its treatment of Ireland is a constant in Gladstone's career and is becoming increasingly pressing as he sees his career coming to an end. If we look at cartoons of Gladstone, they often show him as wrestling with a bull or fighting a devilfish or a knight in armour. And it's often Ireland in those cartoons that he's trying to protect from some sort of evil. When he first becomes Prime Minister in 1868, when he receives the news that he's being summoned to the palace, he's actually chopping down trees on his country estate. And according to legend, he lays down his axe, looks heroically into the middle distance and says, "My mission is to pacify Ireland." So he spent a lot of his time as Prime Minister passing reforms to Irish land tenure or the Irish university system or the Irish education system. But they're not working. It's increasingly clear by the 1880s that liberal reform, they might be good in their own way, but they're not pacifying Ireland, that Ireland is becoming more and more discontented. And so if there is one last great moral work that Gladstone's going to undertake, it's going to be on Ireland. And it's going to be something that involves ripping the roots out of the problem rather than trying to treat its symptoms.
But if the 1885 election was fought on a Chamberlainite platform, a kind of economic populist platform, did that suggest to some people that Chamberlain was the de facto Liberal leader? I mean, to what extent actually did that election seem to some at least to presage the beginning of the end of Gladstone's hold over the party as a new generation, a new agenda, a new kind of politics, post-Third Reform Act politics? This is the new politics of the new democracy. This is not the 1840s. This is not the 1860s. This is the 1880s, the modern age. We're in the modern age. Everyone thinks their age is the latest thing, and it was the latest thing. Was his hold being loosened? Was Chamberlain a genuine rival for the premiership?
Well, everybody in the Liberal Party has been talking about the succession to Gladstone since 1875. It's a rather curious 20-year period in which Gladstone is always on the brink of retiring. So Chamberlain is certainly thinking about the succession. He believes that he should be the successor to Gladstone. He is intensely ambitious and he wants to take the party in a new direction. And one of the pressures for him during the Home Rule crisis is that he is fundamentally opposed to Home Rule. But this is also the party that he wants to lead. And there is a sense that Gladstone might actually go if he gets this done. So everybody is thinking about the succession. But nonetheless, Gladstone does retain this extraordinary power over the Liberal following in the country, a following that Chamberlain can't match at this time. He also can't match Gladstone in the House of Commons. He's very severely embarrassed by Gladstone when he tries to face him in the 1890s over Home Rule. So Gladstone's power, in a sense, is still unbroken in the party, but there is the hope among his critics that it might be coming to an end.
One more background question before we fly the kite. Home Rule itself. So in the range of possible options for Ireland, Was there clarity, was there consensus about what Home Rule meant? So Home Rule meant a parliament for Ireland, a parliament in Dublin, and there were models of it within the empire. So we also have to remember this is all taking place within the context of the empire and the question of where different kinds of dominions exist relative to the mother country in the empire is one that has been discussed in many different permutations. So Ireland offers a range of possible options for people who think this isn't working. When we talk about Home Rule, when it was discussed in 1885, 1886, did everyone agree on what that meant?
No, they don't. Home rule is a little bit like Brexit, in the sense it's a slogan that expresses an aspiration and a direction of travel. But if you then have to translate it into reality, you can do that in lots of different ways. So home rule can mean anything from stronger local government to a complete reorganisation of the United Kingdom. So one version of home rule is what's called home rule all round, in which you will federalise the UK, you will have parliaments for all of its different areas, all of which sit underneath the imperial parliament at Westminster.
Would that include an English parliament?
Yes. It might even include several different English parliaments. There are lots of different models here. And that ambiguity in some ways is a source of strength. It means that you can draw together people who might want different things from Home Rule. But it's also potentially a source of weakness, because what is it that they're actually asking for? Is Home Rule a refounding of the Union on a new basis, which will then enable a more peaceful relationship between Great Britain and Ireland? Or is it simply a stepping stone to something more dangerous, which might be separation or separatism? And one of the challenges that Gladstone has, actually, once he's publicly committed to Home Rule, is he then has to sit down and at pace work out what it might actually mean. And people who support Home Rule in principle can disagree radically on things like, do you have two separate Home Rule parliaments in North and South? Do you maintain Irish MPs at Westminster or not? And I think it's important to say, as you've just hinted, that this is still a time when independent nation states are quite unusual, in which most parts of the world are part of multinational empires or union states. So you can look around the world and you can say, well, maybe we want to be like Austria-Hungary, or maybe we want to be like the Union of Norway and Sweden, or maybe we want to be like Canada and Australia within the British Empire. And these things all work in different ways.
You hinted there at one question, which is going to be the question which really blows up British politics, which is the question of North and South in Ireland, and particularly what might happen under Home Rule to those parts of Ireland that actually don't want it and would like to retain the status quo and the relationship with the Westminster Parliament. And the shorthand for that bit of Ireland is Ulster. That's going to become the term. In the mid-1880s, given this is going to be the absolutely central question, was it clear then that this was going to be the hardest thing to resolve? Or did the Ulster question, as the flashpoint, the real flashpoint, come later?
I think at this stage, the Ulster problem is seriously underestimated by both Home Rulers and by the Liberal leadership.
And one could say, ironically, as was repeated in the Brexit case and the Northern Irish question.
So if you were looking to build a movement against Home Rule, you would absolutely start in Ulster, because that's where the strongest concentration of Protestants and loyalists, as they're called in Ireland, is to be found. It's also the richest part of Ireland, so it's the part that has the most to fear from a parliament in Dublin that is elected by poor agricultural labourers in the south. It's also the part of Ireland that is most integrated into the British and the imperial economy. Belfast is a great city of the British Empire. It's a centre of shipbuilding and engineering and manufacturing. So again, it has a lot to lose from anything that might sever it from the British economy. So figures like Lord Randolph Churchill, the father of Winston, Lord Salisbury, the leader of the Conservative Party, do spend a lot of time stirring up opposition in Ulster and trying to make clear that this is the place where the fight is going to happen. But I think there is a tendency to underplay that threat. And that's partly because most British politicians don't actually know Ireland very well. Gladstone himself only ever went to Ireland once. Gladstone knows Ireland from the books on his shelves. And he's reading in those books about leaders of Irish nationalism who are Protestant landowners. There is a long history of that. So the great hope is that actually Home Rule can be a cause that will bring the Protestants of Ulster on board too. This is still a time when nationalism is generally seen as a liberal and a progressive phenomenon, and that loyalty to Ireland is what is going to bring Catholics and Protestants together. It is what will bring together the landless labourers and the landowning classes. And paradoxically, actually, I think Gladstone and indeed Parnell are quite slow to realise that democratisation has changed what Irish nationalism is going to mean. Because if you have a parliament in Dublin that is democratically elected, that is going to be an overwhelmingly Catholic parliament. This is not going to be the Irish parliament of the 18th century, which is dominated by a Protestant gentry. So they are behind the curve in the sense that this is actually where the big problem is going to come. They tend to assume that Ulster will just lump it, and once it's inside a Home Rule Parliament, it will work with it and make it succeed.
So now let's zoom in on December 1885. Where did British politics stand in the aftermath of the election? Elections were not the decisive events they are today in the sense that everyone stayed up overnight, a result was declared, and there was a general understanding of, therefore, who would be Prime Minister and what it would mean. It was an inconclusive result in many ways, as elections in the second half of the 19th century sometimes were. Describe the balance of power between the two main parties and where the Irish party stood in between them in the aftermath of the 1885 election. Who was it assumed? You called him Parnell. I'm going to call him Parnell. Apparently you can say both before we get, as people used to say, letters. What was it assumed that Parnell would do? He wanted Home Rule for Ireland, or one of the variants of it, probably further along the spectrum than many might be comfortable with. Who was it assumed that he was going to prop up in Downing Street?
It's a really difficult election to call, and the political landscape in its immediate aftermath is especially uncertain, because this is the first election under the new franchise that's been created in 1884, 1885. The electorate has been expanded to include agricultural labourers across the UK, and that in particular has a huge effect in Ireland. So it triples the electorate in Ireland. And the effect of that is a really strange result, in which the Liberals win 86 more seats than the Conservatives. And 86 is exactly the number of MPs won by the Irish Parliamentary Party. So the Irish Parliamentary Party, the Nationalist Party, wins every constituency outside of Ulster except for Dublin University. And it actually wins just over half of all the seats in Ulster as well. So essentially, everywhere outside the Protestant core of Ulster has delivered the same electoral verdict. Now, no one knows what Parnell is going to do with that, because actually before the election, he had leaned more towards the Conservatives. There's a recognition that he can use his power to increase the pressure on the Liberal Party by aligning with conservatism, because of course it's not his primary goal to make government at Westminster work. It's his primary goal to make government at Westminster give Ireland what it wants. So the election is hugely important, but there are different readings of what happens afterwards. The Unionists argue that Gladstone has done something shameful. He knows he can only govern with the support of the Irish nationalists. He cannot govern against the united opposition of the Conservatives and the Irish Parliamentary Party, so he is selling off the Union in order to stay in power. Liberals, on the other hand, say, look, we have just tripled the electorate in Ireland. We have just created a democratic electorate, and they have told us as decisively as it is possible to do that they want Home Rule. So do we believe in what we did in the Third Reform Act, or don't we? If we do, then we have to recognise that something has moved in the waters of Irish democracy, and we have to respond to it. So whether you think that Gladstone is selling the Union, or whether you think that he is acknowledging the democratic will of the Irish people, is one of the questions that people are struggling with in the months after the election results.
And into this, the bomb that goes off is known as the Hawarden Kite. It's an interview given by Gladstone's son, Herbert, who was a backbench MP, I believe, aged about early 30s, but very close to his father, thought to be in his father's confidence. But this is the son speaking. This is not the old man speaking. And in not just one interview, but a couple of interviews reported in different places, Herbert Gladstone lets it be known that his father has now fully embraced the idea that a future Gladstone government would be required to deliver Home Rule for Ireland. I don't know if in putting it like that, I'm actually making it somewhat more unambiguous than it was, but it was pretty clear to most people that what Herbert seemed to be saying, and one of the questions which we're going to come on to is either with or without his father's blessing, was that his father was now committed to Home Rule for Ireland. Do we know if this was done with his father's blessing or not?
We don't, no. It remains a subject of speculation. So Herbert was Gladstone's youngest son, and in lots of ways he's seen as his political heir, and he goes on to become a reforming Home Secretary. He becomes Governor-General of South Africa. He's one of the midwives of the Labour Party because he negotiates an electoral pact with Ramsay MacDonald later on. And he's been Gladstone's political secretary. So there is a sense that this isn't just speculation when he speaks, that the suspicion is that he is flying a kite, in the sense that he's putting something up into the sky to see what the reaction is, because it's deniable if it goes very badly wrong. Now, it must be based on conversations he'd had with Gladstone. Ultimately, I think it's probably unlikely that Gladstone had authorised it, because it does backfire very badly. Because Herbert doesn't just say that his father is committed to Home Rule. He says, and the Liberal cabinet is on board, and he mentions various other members of the cabinet who are apparently fine with the idea, who are absolutely furious. So it actively, I think, increases hostility within the Liberal Party to Home Rule, and the sense that this is a kind of autocratic act by an old man who is dragging his party along in his wake. And Gladstone was not a man who was given to jokes. But one of his rare jokes comes in the aftermath of this when he tells one of his fellow ministers that he's had so many telegrams complaining about this subject that the only way to deal with them is to commit suicide. So it really does stir opposition from within his own party. And in that sense, I think it probably is Herbert freelancing.
And was this an unusual way of doing high politics at this period? So understandably, there was a great deal of interest in trying to work out what Gladstone, not just what he believed, but what he wanted. What is Gladstone going to do in the aftermath of the election result? Is he willing to strike a deal with the Irish party? Is he willing to confront the members of his own party who are sceptical and some of them outright hostile to Home Rule? This is not an age in which he's going to go on TV and be quizzed about his intentions. He's not going to give conventional newspaper interviews. He could give a speech, which was the standard form of political communication, but he hasn't given a speech in the aftermath of the election. So this kite is flown, and it does, as we're going to discuss in a moment, really explode. I mean, I don't know if a kite can explode, but its effects are its combustion. The metaphor is getting too confused, but everyone knows what I mean.
I don't think a kite could explode, but it can be struck by lightning and electricity run down the line.
There you go. So the kite caught fire, let's put it like that. But was this seen to be an unusual event? I mean, did people recognise at the time, as soon as Herbert Gladstone's views, ventriloquising it was thought for his father, were published, I think in a Leeds newspaper, and then they were picked up by the hostile Tory press in London, the Evening Standard, and the Tory press then ran with it. As it were, Gladstone's been rumbled. We now know what he's up to. And the readings from the Tory press were all cynical. This is a man who isn't actually on a moral crusade. He wants to be back in power. And this is the lever that he has chosen. But the way in which it completely convulsed, first of all, high Victorian political opinion, and then it became a great national subject. Was there something unusual about this? I mean, should we see this event as exceptional? I don't know enough about the politics of the time to know whether this is actually kind of how they did it. You don't know what these men are thinking, so it's all kite flying in a way.
It is unusual, and that's partly why the Tory press take it up. So you're absolutely right to say that this starts off in a regional newspaper and is then deliberately made into a big story by the Tory press. And they do that because they want to tell a particular story here. That what this is about one man's vanity and dogmatism, that Gladstone has decided there must be Home Rule, and the Liberal Party is now going to fall at his feet and worship. And that this actually isn't just about an objectionable policy, it's about an objectionable way of doing politics, in which Gladstone has become a kind of dictator who is no longer subject to the normal rules of politics, by which you discuss things with your cabinet, you try to win the support of your party, that he is now an autocrat. And that's another reason why I'm a little bit wary of the idea that this is in fact an authorised stunt. But what it also does is it distracts attention away from a bigger question, which is this isn't just about Gladstone. Most of the Liberal Party goes with him, and actually goes with him enthusiastically. What we actually have to explain in 1886 is not just Gladstone's conversion, it's the conversion of three-quarters of the Liberal Party to an extraordinarily radical policy. The Tories want to tell this as a story about Gladstone, but there is something bigger going on here, and the kite potentially distracts attention from that.
Is it possible that Herbert was flushing him out? I don't think anyone would deny that the things that Herbert said were true, in the sense his father had come round to this position. He just hadn't stated it publicly yet, and it wasn't clear he wanted to state it publicly at the end of December. He might have chosen a different time or a different way of doing it. But once, as it were, the news was out, it was presumably effectively not deniable by Gladstone. He was not going to issue any kind of statement in which he said, that's not true. So once it was out there, he was more or less committed to it, wasn't he?
I'm not sure I go that far. I mean, the only thing that's actually on the record from Herbert Gladstone is a letter that he writes about his own opinion. And actually, it's not news that Herbert Gladstone supports Home Rule. He had supported Home Rule and has said so publicly many times in the years before 1886. So since Gladstone doesn't have to issue a denial, this isn't obviously our culture of 24-hour media in which it's expected that someone from the government goes on the Today programme and answers questions. You can simply remain quiet as a senior minister. But in that respect, the kite is an example of something that's happening among the younger members of the Liberal Party, that there is actually a move towards Home Rule happening among young Liberals. And that's partly because Liberals are deeply embarrassed by the government of Ireland. They think of themselves as the good guys, and they keep having to legislate to suspend trial by jury, to suspend freedom of the press, to shut down mass organisations that are developing in Ireland. This isn't what they came into politics in order to do. Ireland seems to be the issue that is turning them all into Tories. And part of the attraction of Home Rule is it suddenly gives Liberals something to believe in. They actually have a positive policy now that might fix Ireland permanently and save the Union. And part of the promise of Home Rule is that it doesn't repeal the Union, it mends and restores the Union. And instead of the corrupt Union that you had in 1800, in which there was simply systematic bribery of Irish representatives, you will now have a union of hearts. And there are all sorts of slightly mawkish cartoons produced in this period of England and Ireland smooching or locked in an embrace, because this is actually going to create a union that we can be proud of rather than one that we're having to coerce.
So I hesitate to do this, but you mentioned Brexit early on as an analogy here. And I was trying to think of, if you strip out everything that we've said about how politics then operated at a different pace, in a different way, completely different communication environment. But nonetheless, trying to think of the contemporary analogy for this. And I'm just going to ask you if this is too far-fetched, but it seems to me like there is a version of this which would be, so there isn't a son involved, his children are too young, but say Keir Starmer's wife, and say it was in the aftermath of an election that had produced a hung parliament. Or his chief of staff, Morgan McSweeney, whoever it is, but they let it be known in an interview that Starmer has come round to Britain rejoining the European Union. And say that were to happen, some of the members of Keir Starmer's party would be absolutely delighted, and some of them would be absolutely horrified. And there probably is a chance that the party would split. And there would also probably be a feeling that maybe he had thought that all along and he's finally been flushed out. And it would probably blow up British politics. One can imagine, if you wanted to think of an interview that might blow up British politics, it probably would be Morgan McSweeney speaking to local radio in Leeds and letting it be known that Keir Starmer had actually come round to Britain rejoining the European Union. Does that analogy work, or am I pushing it?
No, I think it does work, except you'd have to imagine a leader with much more prestige and many more decades behind him than Keir Starmer. But I think the reason why it works is interesting. Most Labour MPs and most voters, I suspect, don't have a burning passion about Britain's trade relations with the European Union. The point about Brexit is that it becomes a focal point for all the things that people really do care about. It becomes about sovereignty, about democracy, about immigration, about who governs Britain, about what kind of country we think we are. It becomes a kind of question of morals and identity. And Home Rule is like that, dialed up by 10. So for most British politicians, Home Rule is not really about how you govern Ireland. It's about religion. It's about race. It's about empire. It's about democracy and freedom. It's about national security. It's about what kind of empire Britain is. It's about who rules Britain. And that's why it becomes so explosive. Of all of the various questions that we could talk about across the 19th, 20th, and 21st centuries, where something erupts in Westminster that blows up the party system and spills beyond it, this is the big one. This is the one that is most potent and most destructive. And that's because it takes everything that liberal politicians care most about and it lights them up behind this one policy.
Were Starmer to do that, and I have to say I don't think he is going to do that, but were Starmer to do that, the charge from the Tory press would be this is a purely cynical move. It would be assumed that he was doing it because he could cobble together a majority in the Commons for that, which you probably could. The House of Commons probably still is more anti-Brexit than the voting public. And it might be a way that Starmer brought the Liberal Democrats, the Scottish National Party. He might be able to assemble a coalition out of that policy, but then he would have an awfully hard time delivering it. And that seems to me also analogous with the situation we're talking about here, because after all, the flying of the Hawarden Kite did bring Gladstone back to power. I mean, it did have that effect. He did become Prime Minister within months, a Prime Minister committed to Home Rule for Ireland, and therefore committed to passing that legislation in the House of Commons. He now has the support of the Irish party, but he has lost the support of those members of his own party who are opposed to it. And in the end, the consequence is not Home Rule for Ireland. The consequence is the Liberal Party splits. And it happens very quickly, doesn't it? I mean, for an event, we talk about this thing, an interview in a Leeds newspaper, but my God, within 6 months, British politics has been turned on its head.
Yes, it's absolutely shattering. This breaks apart the party that has dominated British politics for the previous 40 years. It takes some of the leading figures of the Liberal Party, washes them overboard, and sweeps them across the House to an alliance with the Conservative Party. It breaks up friendships. It ruptures old alliances. It shatters the women's suffrage movement, actually. All sorts of other movements are blown to pieces because this bomb has gone off and suddenly everybody is on different sides of the battle line. So there's been nothing like this really since the 1840s.
So how did the parliamentary arithmetic play out? We need to now tell the story of why Home Rule was not delivered by this third Gladstone administration, despite, among other things, Gladstone delivering what is thought still, I think, to be one of the great speeches in British parliamentary history. His speech in defence of Home Rule, taking on his opponents, including his opponents within his own party. But he loses the vote. So how is it that within 6 months, Gladstone, who you would think if you add the votes of the Irish party in the House of Commons to the Liberal votes after the 1885 election, would be enough to deliver a majority for Home Rule. How and why does he fail to do that? Were there more opponents in his own party than he realised? Was it a failure of parliamentary management? Was it always, actually, when you look at it with hindsight, a quixotic endeavour because there simply wasn't a majority in the Commons for Home Rule? Or was it because, as we said earlier, actually it really mattered what you meant by Home Rule, and the version that Gladstone was offering in 1886 couldn't command a majority?
So I think there are problems with the version that Gladstone is offering, as there would be with any version he might have offered. And here again, there is another Brexit analogy, that the number of people who supported Brexit as an idea was always larger than the number of people who supported any specific version of Brexit. So if you put forward Theresa May's deal or Boris Johnson's deal or a no deal, you're going to lose a segment of those who might back the scheme in principle. So, for example, Gladstone decides that Irish MPs will no longer sit at Westminster. so that they can no longer vote on English and Scottish questions that don't affect them anymore. But that loses the support of some Home Rulers, because it means that Ireland will now have no say over imperial policy or over kind of macroeconomic questions. Some of them see it as actually reducing the status of Ireland to that of a colony rather than to a part of the United Kingdom. Gladstone tries to accompany the Act with an Irish Land Act, which will provide state funds to buy out the estates of landlords and sell them to Irish farmers. And this is partly an attempt to solve the Irish land question before Home Rule gets going, so that you don't have to worry about what an Irish Parliament might do. But there are lots of radical liberals who don't want the state's money spent bailing out the Irish aristocracy. So any decision that you make is going to snap off a part of your coalition. But that's not the principal problem. The principal problem is that you're asking the Liberal Party to make an astonishing policy shift, which does have huge implications for the empire, for national security, for the safety of Protestants in Ireland, for the safety of property in Ireland. And 3/4 of them agree to make that jump, but 1/4 does not. So 93 MPs, I think, vote against the bill and bring it down. And it's a very unlikely alliance of Whig aristocrats, so those we might see as being on the right of the Liberal Party, who are particularly hostile to Irish nationalism. So Lord Hartington, for example, who becomes the leader of the Liberal Unionists, his brother has been assassinated by Irish nationalists. This is deeply and intensely personal to him. But alongside that, you've got some of the most radical figures in the Liberal Party, like Joe Chamberlain. I mean, Joe Chamberlain really is the kind of Zara Sultana of the Liberal Party at this point. He's the person who is most associated with radical causes and progressive ideas, but he's also fundamentally somebody who believes in the greatness of the empire. And so he goes through this terrible internal struggle as to what to do, and finds himself stepping out of the Liberal Party and aligning himself with the Conservatives. It's kind of like, I don't know, Robert Jenrick leaving the Conservative Party and aligning himself with Keir Starmer. It's an extraordinary political moment, but that's what Home Rule does. It is such a powerful issue that it's like pouring acid on the conventional dividing lines of politics, and suddenly all sorts of barriers that used to separate people have just been eaten away.
I don't want to overdo the Brexit analogy, but as you were speaking, it is also true that I don't want to talk about Zara Sultana herself because I don't actually know what her views are here, but Jeremy Corbyn was always very sympathetic to Brexit as an idea. He comes from that tradition of the Labour Party, which saw the European Union as a kind of capitalist club. Were British politics to blow up again around the Brexit question, I think less likely than Robert Jenrick joining the Labour Party is the possibility that some people on the left of the Labour Party might find themselves making common cause with the opponents of Britain rejoining the European Union because of their belief in national sovereignty. National sovereignty is an issue that does, under some circumstances, unite the further left and the further right in British politics. So it is comparable, I think, in those ways too, that there are these grand principled questions which do have this weird ability to make a mockery of conventional party allegiances. Europe is that issue in our time, and it sounds like Ireland was that issue in the last third of the 19th century.
Yes, or at least Ireland is the focal point for those issues, which might be empire or might be race or might be religion in the late 19th, early 20th century. So both Home Rule and Brexit speak to the kind of big moral questions that are often fundamental to why people are in politics in the first place. And in that sense, they have an extraordinary capacity to break conventional party loyalties. But as we saw in the Brexit crisis, this isn't just about rational MPs thinking about their political priors and making judgments accordingly. These are people operating under astonishing levels of pressure, who are deeply disorientated, dismayed, their friendships are breaking up, their constituency associations are disowning them, or perhaps breaking apart. Queen Victoria is behaving utterly unconstitutionally in this period. She absolutely comes out as an opponent of Home Rule. She's writing to the Whig aristocracy demanding that they be loyal to her. She's encouraging them to organise demonstrations against her own government. People who have been political allies and deep friends for years suddenly can't speak to one another anymore. So people aren't thinking entirely rationally. There's a very moving interview, actually, I think in 1888, with John Bright, who had been one of the iconic liberal figures of the 19th century, the champion of free trade, the critic of the Crimean War, and somebody who breaks with Gladstone over Home Rule. And he's interviewed by an Irish journalist called Barry O'Brien. And it's an extraordinary interview because O'Brien actually records it almost verbatim. And he records his gestures as he's speaking and the long pauses. And Bright can hardly get his words out. He's twisting his fingers. He's shuffling his feet. He lowers his head, and there are periods when he can't speak for several minutes because he's so overcome with emotion, because he thinks of himself as a friend of Ireland. He's always been a radical on Irish questions. And now, at the end of his life, he's breaking with his party in order to deny Ireland self-government. So these decisions are incredibly painful.
Why, for Bright, could he not go with Gladstone? Which of those various strands of opposition was he?
It's partly about an analogy with the American Civil War, that Bright had been a supporter of the North in the American Civil War, which Gladstone incidentally had not. And a lot of liberals see an analogy here, that you didn't allow the South of the United States to secede from the Union. You defend what you believe is a liberal and progressive union against what appears to you to be an illiberal and reactionary secessionist movement. And he is deeply alarmed by what a kind of Catholic-dominated, priest-dominated Southern Ireland is going to be like.
So I want to then ask you the role of religion in this, because we've talked about this without really addressing that question. So for someone like Bright, the fear is actually that democracy for Ireland means Catholic rule, priestly rule, as some of them said, Rome being in charge. The old fears that actually, if you give democracy to a part of the union which is dominated by Catholics, the person who will end up running the show is the Pope. To what extent were those kinds of visceral religious fears, traditional enmities and responses bubbling through this?
So this is still a society in which religion is the most powerful political, cultural, and intellectual force. You can't really separate religion from any major political question in this period. And it's also a time when sectarianism is still very powerful. And not just in Ireland, but in many British cities. You will have riots and fights breaking out between not just Catholics and Protestants, but between different versions of Protestantism. So religion is always a live rail. And I think that the element that can be difficult to grasp in retrospect is that opponents of Home Rule often see themselves as the champions of religious freedom. So they argue that actually what you have under British rule is total freedom of worship. Catholics can follow their faith exactly as they wish to do so. And they say, where in the world is there a Catholic state that gives that right to Protestants? They argue that actually it's not about the doctrines of Roman Catholicism. It's about the structure of Roman Catholicism as a church that is inherently authoritarian, that is under the rule of the Pope in Rome, in which people have to entrust their deepest, darkest secrets to their priests in the confessional, and in which, therefore, the priests are a political power in the land. And their fear is that if you grant Home Rule, that's not kind of giving rights to Catholics. That is placing Protestants under the control of a church that wants to burn them out. And they'll point to things like Catholic doctrine on marriages between Protestants and Catholics, or Catholic teachings on how the children of mixed marriages should be brought up. And they say this is a church that cannot tolerate dissent, and that therefore a Catholic Ireland will be an authoritarian and oppressive Ireland. It's a very difficult argument to grasp nowadays, but that's why so many people who think that they are liberals are deeply concerned about Home Rule.
And Gladstone's response to this argument was what?
So Gladstone, I think, does passionately believe that nationality can be the kind of magic elixir that resolves these disputes. He is also actually increasingly convinced that the kind of core claim I've just outlined there, that actually Protestant rule over Catholics is absolutely fine, has proven itself to be untrue. That it is manifestly the case that Catholics have been discriminated against routinely throughout the history of British rule in Ireland, and that there is a kind of historic debt there that has to be paid. Although Gladstone himself is absolutely a Protestant, and indeed is quite deeply anti-papal He does increasingly believe that Protestantism has to win by the force of its arguments, not by its control over the political machinery of state.
In the second part of this conversation, we're going to take the story forward. There's a long way to go in this story, and the drama is only going to ratchet up. And Gladstone's failure in 1886 to deliver Home Rule was not his last try, and it was not his last failure. But the aftermath of the defeat of the Home Rule Bill in the summer of 1886 was another general election. And I think in order to take the story forward, the first step is to understand the consequences of that election, because it was another extraordinary election in its way. And it signalled the ways in which the flying of the kite within a year had completely changed the dynamics of British politics. So just take us through what happened after Gladstone's administration fell. And it was only in office for, I think, 4 or 5 months. It was in office to deliver Home Rule. It failed to deliver Home Rule. It didn't get it through the Commons, never mind the Lords, which is another question which we're going to have to come on to. I mean, had he won that vote, that wouldn't have settled it. Nonetheless, the administration fell because its central mission had fallen at the first hurdle. There was an election. What did the people in that election, what message did they send?
So in the final vote in Parliament that brings down the Home Rule Bill, Gladstone gives an extraordinary speech in which he says to the opposition, "You have wealth, you have power, you have privilege, you have status. What have we? We believe that we have the people's heart." And so when the bill falls, he then tests that idea by going to the country and calling a general election. And the result is absolutely shattering. The Liberals are reduced to 193 seats. That's worse than the Conservatives in 1945. It's worse than Labour in 2019. It's a devastating defeat. And it's not just about what happens at the polls. It's about what happens before you even get to the polls. All over the country, Liberal constituency associations simply collapse because they split into pro and anti-Home Rule factions. Constituency chairs and candidates are on opposite sides of this debate. In almost a quarter of constituencies, the Liberals can't even put up a candidate because they just can't agree where the candidate should stand on this question. So it's an absolute devastation. Now, we might assume from that that would be the end of Gladstone's career, that the Liberals would now drop Home Rule. But instead, they double down on it, because firstly, what you're left with is a party that is much more committed to Home Rule. What's left are the kind of the pure in heart, those who really believe in this. But also, when you look in more detail at election results, they're not as bad for the Liberals as they look. They've been smashed, but they've been smashed because they couldn't run candidates in large parts of the country. Turnout has collapsed. It's not that Liberal voters move across to the Conservatives. It seems that they're just rather confused by the question, so they simply stay at home. The Conservatives don't win a majority. They're now locked in an uneasy coalition with the Liberal rebels, with people like Joe Chamberlain, who have been the absolute demon figure for the Conservatives for years beforehand. So actually there's quite an unstable unionist coalition in power, and there's now a pure and energised Home Rule party in opposition. So Gladstone does something extraordinary, which is that he decides that his party will spend the next 6 years campaigning around the country to convince people that Home Rule is correct, to reverse the electoral judgment of 1886. It's an astonishing example of turning to the electorate and saying, "You're wrong. This is why. I think I can bring you round." And in 1892, the Liberals do indeed return to power and get another chance at Home Rule.
And that is where we're going to pick up the story in part 2. The second part of my conversation with Robert Saunders is available from tomorrow as a bonus episode on PPF Plus. So if you would like to listen, do please subscribe. Just click on the link in our show description or go to our website, ppfideas.com. You'll get all of our bonus episodes, and in this case, you'll be able to hear how this story reached its really remarkable climax in the years from 1912 to 1914, when Britain really did come closer to actual civil war than at any time since the actual civil wars of the 17th century. How did the British Conservative Party end up arming paramilitary organisations to resist the rule of law by violence? If you'd like to hear that story, subscribe to PPF Plus now. Next time in our regular slot, it is back to politics on trial for the final tranche of episodes, starting with the case of Cassius Clay, or as he became known, Muhammad Ali, and his fight against being drafted to Vietnam. Do join us for that. This has been Past, Present, Future.